I have a couple of videos for tonight. We're going to start off with our normal video, the last one in the narrative series that we have watched the first 3 videos of. And then I have a special treat. If we can get through class pretty quickly, I have a little 15-minute video at the end of class tonight that is phenomenal. I think you guys are really going to love it. And it won't show up on the recordings because of some copyright stuff. So if you have prioritized being here, you're going to get a little treat for tonight. One of my favorite Bible teachers breaking down the form of the whole Torah as a single unit. And it's absolutely fantastic. I think you're going to love it. So let's start off with some prayer, and then we'll dive into the first video and go on from there. So Father God, we just are so thankful for this time that we get to spend in your word tonight. Lord, I just ask you to bless our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, let's hit that first video. And I didn't give Fred enough time.
We've been exploring how biblical narratives work. And it turns out stories in the Bible are like any other story. You've got to pay attention to the characters, the setting, and the plot.
Yeah, these are the basic tools an author uses to help readers see the meaning and significance of the event. Now, it's time to learn one final skill that will bring all these elements together: how to detect design patterns in biblical narrative.
What do you mean by design patterns?
Well, the biblical authors have shaped all these elements, character, setting, and plot, to create series of repeated patterns that weave through story after story and tie them all together. When you notice these patterns, you'll see how different stories across the whole Bible have been coordinated to emphasize key themes.
This sounds interesting, but how do you know how to find a biblical pattern?
Well, biblical authors do it subtly. The best way to catch on is to watch them embed key words and images that link stories together. Take, for example, one of the main themes of the Bible, the complex and tragic human condition.
Okay.
So let's start at the beginning, where God is making a really good world.
Right, 7 times it says God saw that it was good.
So those are clearly important words. Now watch. God appoints 2 characters named Human and Life to rule this world on his behalf, and they're told that everything is good for them to eat.
Except for the tree of knowing good and evil.
So then the humans doubt God, and in Genesis we read, they see that it's good to take this knowledge for themselves. Then we read, they desire to become wise, and then finally, they take what they want.
And everything falls apart. This story is about the human condition.
And on its own, it's a really powerful story, but the biblical authors don't leave it there. They turn it into a pattern. It happens again with Abraham and Sarah. God brings them into the promised land, promises them a child. But they don't trust God, they get impatient, and we read the same words. They see their Egyptian slave, they take her and do what is good in their eyes. You get it?
Yeah, the stories match.
Then you get to Aaron and Mount Sinai, and we read how he sees and then takes the gold of the Israelites to make the golden calf. Or there's the story about Achan, who sees the gold of the Canaanites, he desires it and takes it for himself.
This pattern highlights how one person's temptation can create suffering for many people.
Exactly. It's just like the story of Saul, where we read that the Israelites see him. They desire him and take him as their king so they can be like all the other nations.
And Saul's reign leads them to destruction.
Or there's the story of David, which says that he sees Bathsheba, he desires her and then takes her and then kills her husband.
And then David's family starts destroying each other.
So you see, it's just one basic theme repeated over and over. These stories are all designed to show the temptation pattern.
Which is kind of a downer.
But the repetition builds up anticipation. Perhaps someone will come and break the pattern. This is why the stories of Jesus have been designed to carry the patterns forward to their climax.
Really?
Yeah, like what does Jesus say when he's faced with his greatest temptation to avoid dying on the cross?
Not my desire, but your desire be done.
So the pattern flips, and you have one person resisting temptation, and his suffering provides life for many.
Very cool. Can we do one more?
Totally. How about a big one? How God brings humanity through chaotic waters into a new world. It starts on page 1, where God separates these dark, chaotic waters.
Yeah, dry land emerges as a home for humans to flourish.
Then the pattern reappears with the chaotic waters of the flood. God rescues this remnant, Noah and his family, through the waters so that they can step onto dry land and become humanity 2.0. Now, the Does that basic storyline remind you of anything else?
Oh, right, the famous Exodus story.
Yeah, exactly. That's when God saves his chosen people from Egypt by leading them through the waters onto dry land.
While Pharaoh and his army is destroyed.
The pattern repeats later with Joshua and the Israelites.
They pass through the waters of the Jordan into the Promised Land.
Yeah, you got it. So now you can see how later biblical authors will project this pattern into the future. Like Isaiah, he hoped for a new Exodus with a new king, leading God's people forward into a new creation. And in this repetition, the nations become the chaotic waters.
So you can see how combining all these patterns brings us to Jesus.
Yeah, notice how all the Gospels highlight that story of Jesus going to the Jordan River. He goes into the waters and back out again.
His baptism.
That's when God announces that Jesus is his son, who will rescue the world from the chaos of our evil and violence by going into death and out the other side. This is why baptism became such a big deal for Jesus' followers. It's about participating in this ancient pattern, going through the waters of death, following Jesus into the new creation.
These design patterns seem really important.
Yeah, they're actually the main way biblical authors have unified these hundreds of stories together. And every pattern develops a core theme throughout the whole biblical story that leads to Jesus.
Great. That's biblical narrative, which makes up over 40% of the Bible. Now, another 30% is made up of ancient poetry.
And learning to read biblical poetry is what we'll explore in the next videos.
So I'm not going to explore biblical poetry with you guys, but you are more than welcome to go watch those videos on your own, and I highly recommend it. But we've been talking a lot about the form of the Torah, how it's been assembled, how it's been put together, and I think it was this book that you worked through so long ago now, the book that form conveys meaning. And I think that understanding how that's put together in biblical narrative is something that we don't talk about enough. And that's why I like it so much. So tonight, we are going to finish up the book of Numbers. We have 7 chapters to get through, and it's going to be great. And let's go. So Numbers chapter 30, we have men in vows and women in vows. And okay, so we got to a point last week in Numbers 28 and 29 where Moses was talking about the feasts again. And we remembered the feast because Leviticus 23 was all about the feasts. And so we kind of have hit this point in the book of Numbers where the first generation has died out, all the generation that was rebellious, and they didn't want to go into the promised land, they were scared of the giants, and now it's the second generation. And Moses is sort of reiterating and repeating what happened at Sinai with the first generation and giving the highlights to the second generation. So this is sort of a pre-Deuteronomy, if you want to think about it that way. When we get next week, starting in the book of Deuteronomy, Deutero is the Greek word for two or second, and nomos is the Greek word for law. And so you get Deuteronomy, second law. It's the second time the law is given because it's the second generation that came out of Egypt. We're starting to get into that at the end of the book of Numbers. And you might remember that we talked about vows before. It was actually how the book of Leviticus ended. So you had Leviticus 26, and it was the blessings for obedience and the cursings for disobedience, and it seemed like the perfect place to end the book. And it even had this nice little conclusion statement at the end of chapter 26, and then the book kept going for a chapter. And it was like Moses forgot to talk about vows. And we even had, at the time, we talked about Jephthah's vow, we talked about all those things. And so here we are again, getting back into vows. And so in Numbers chapter 30, it says, this is what Yahweh has commanded. If a man vows a vow to Yahweh or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. That seems pretty simple, right? If you vow a vow, then you need to do it. So what about a woman? It says if a woman vows a vow to Yahweh and binds herself by a pledge. So what does that mean? And why is it different? What does it mean to bind herself by a pledge? Did you catch the difference that men vow a vow, but women bind themselves?
Is that committing to a marriage?
It is actually the opposite of committing to a marriage. It is, if I go over here to the word pledge, it's the Hebrew word Isar. And if you look over here on the right side of the screen at the top, it says a vow of abstinence. So if a woman binds herself by a pledge and it wants to take essentially what is a vow of abstinence, it's been lost in translation, but that's what the Hebrew word means, and she's in her father's house in her youth, what might her father do? He might say, no, that's a bad idea because I'm planning on marrying you off to this man, and if you take this vow of abstinence, then that kind of totally ruins the whole thing. So her father has the ability to oppose, in verse 5, if her father opposes her, on the day he hears of it, no vow of hers, no pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand. And Yahweh will forgive her because her father opposed her. So if I just kind of take that at face value, what I'm seeing is that a young woman can't ruin her future. And God has sort of put this father in place to protect her from taking this rash vow. In a sense, it's almost like a Jephthah's vow sort of situation, where the father is there to protect the young woman from taking this vow in the same sense that Jephthah did. But let's say she's not a youth anymore. She's not in her father's house. Now she gets married. And she vows, if she marries a husband, well under her vows or any thoughtless utterance of her lips by which she has bound herself, and her husband hears of it, and says nothing to her on the day that he hears, her vow shall stand. But if on that day her husband hears of it, he opposes her, then he makes void her vow that was on her, and the thoughtless utterance of her lips by which she bound herself, and Yahweh will forgive her. And I want to jump down here to the very end, and I think that this right here, this line in verse 15, really helps me understand the point of this, because our culture, although I believe is still very patriarchal in many ways, is much less patriarchal than what ancient Israel was. We have a tendency to read this and see the rights of women sort of imposed on. And I think that's a result of being in our culture. I think what we're supposed to see is the rights of women being elevated above what it otherwise would have been in other cultures at this time. And so what verse 15 says is, if he, her husband, makes her vow null and void after he has heard of it, then he shall bear her iniquity. So I think what's going on here is this is really justice for women. It's really the idea of taking a group of people who, because of the culture that they live in, are easily taken advantage of, and providing an opportunity for them to be provided for. It's hard to look at it as equality in any sense, because it is still very much a patriarchal culture. But it is making it so that a disadvantaged group of people, women, in ancient Israel, can't just be taken advantage of. Does that make sense? Are you guys with me? Anyone have a problem with that? We're all cool? I'm going to keep going, because I'm really trying to have that 15 minutes at the end. So, okay. Vengeance on Midian. So Moses has one more job to do before he is going to get killed. And it says here in verse 2, avenge the people of Israel on the Midianites. Afterwards you shall be gathered to your people. So God's like, this is the last thing that I need you to do, and then once you've done it, I'm going to go ahead and kill you, but I need you to do this first. Why? What do the Midianites need to be avenged for?
Balaam.
The Baal incident, Baal at Peor. You remember Numbers chapter 25? And the Midianites tempted Israel to worship their gods and to take their women, and they got involved in this false god idol worship, and it was Phinehas, you remember, he put an end to the false god worship by spearing the Israelite and Midianite woman, Israelite man and Midianite woman. And that was where we saw the Levitical covenant sort of come to its fruition and be made there with Phinehas, where the promise was that the tribe of Levi would always have a priest serving in the priesthood, and it was sort of that perpetual covenant. And we're going to see that obviously fulfilled in Jesus. But going back to the Peor. Okay. So Moses tells the people, send a bunch of armed men. I think it's 1,000 from every tribe. And so there were 12,000 men. They were armed for war. And I love this, 1,000 from each tribe together with Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest. So just in case we forgot that the incident that we're dealing with is Baal at Peor, it's Phinehas who seems to be mentioned as though he's some sort of leader of the army. Like his zeal at Peor has made him into this leader, and now that he's killed the one Israelite man and one Midianite woman, now he's going to go wipe out all the rest of the people with 12,000 guys behind him. So they take the trumpets for an alarm. What trumpets are we talking about? You remember the, let me find the reference here, I know I wrote it down. Numbers 10, the silver trumpets. You remember they made the 2 silver trumpets, and they would blow them when they were setting out, and they would blow them when they were stopping, and they would blow them to sound an alarm, and there were all these different things that these trumpets were for. And so they take these trumpets, they sound an alarm, and they go to war against Midian. And they kill the kings of Midian. With the rest of their slain, the kings are Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba. Probably not McIntyre. And they also killed Balaam, the son of Beor, with the sword. So where's Balaam from?
Gilead? Was it Gilead?
Sort of. It's like, yeah, it's right in that area. It was the king of Moab who goes and gets him and brings him there to Moab. So after this whole incident with Moab and Balak, the king of Moab, it seems like Balaam doesn't stay in Moab. Instead, he goes further south to Midian. Because apparently he's there at Midian and gets killed in the assault against Midian. But why? Why kill Balaam? Wasn't he a good dude? Didn't he prophesy about the Star of David and about the coming Messiah who's going to deliver Israel? And didn't he bless Israel 4 times when Balak hired him to curse Israel? Like, if I just look at those aspects of the story, he seems like a pretty good dude.
Did he tell the Moabites to
He counseled the.
yeah. He's the one that caused them to go and intermarry and pray and worship other gods.
And we don't find that out. So if you didn't hear, he said Balaam's the one who caused the Israelites to go and intermarry and worship the gods at Peor. But we don't actually find that out until later on in this chapter, Numbers chapter 31, verse 16. It says, "Behold these." Hold on. I don't want to read that yet. I want to go up first to 13. Moses and Eleazar the priest and all the chiefs of the congregation went to meet them outside the camp. So they have killed all the men of the Midianites. They didn't kill the women. They didn't kill the children. They didn't kill the livestock. They brought all this back. This is the normal spoils of war. And they sent it all back to Moses. So Moses and Eleazar the priest go to meet the Israelites outside the camp. And Moses, by the way, why were the Israelites outside the camp? Because they were unclean. They just went to war. They had this contact with death. What has to happen? Numbers 19. Right, Numbers 19 has to happen. So they're outside the camp. Moses and the priest go and meet them there. Moses was angry with the officers of the army and the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds who had come from service in the war. Moses said to them, "Have you let all the women live?" So he's angry that they've let all the women live. Okay. That seems like, if I don't read the next line, that seems like a weird thing to be angry about. And the next line explains it. It says, "Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against Yahweh in the incident of Peor, and the plague came among the congregation of Yahweh. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourself. And then encamp outside the camp 7 days, and you have purify yourselves, in verse 19, purify yourselves and your captives on the 3rd day and on the 7th day." Okay. So what Balaam did that we did not learn about in Numbers chapter 25. Balaam is not even mentioned, but apparently is a key player in the incident at Peor. And what he did was advise all of the women of Midian how to get all the men of Israel to worship their God. And the advice that he gave was, use your bodies. So, in the Balaam story, there are, so there's this little slogan that I like to teach and I like to remember, that there's three ways to lose your ministry faster than anything else. Gold, glory, girls. Fastest way to lose a ministry, right? If you chase after money, well, how did the Balaam story start? Balak was like, I'll send you all the money in my house. And Balaam was like, I can't go unless it was all the money in your house. And then there's the glory and I guess you could look at the glory as like the prophecies and the worshiping, the putting up the altars and all these things. And then the girls is now the incident at Peor. And so gold, glory, girls, and man, that really just sums up Balaam's whole story. Why, in verse 19, purify yourselves and your captives on the third and on the seventh day? So the captives, this is talking about the young girls, the ones who weren't killed, of the Midianites. We've talked about before how the law is not just applicable to Israel, but is for Gentiles as well. And so I don't think it's any news to you or really a major revelation to see that in order to become part of the nation of Israel, even through whether it was marriage or whether it was, I don't know how to say it, but concubinehood, through being taken captive, they could not just become part of the camp without going through this ritual purification. You're going to see the same thing happen in Joshua 6, I think it is, with Rahab. When she becomes a part of Israel after Jericho is destroyed, she goes through this ritual purification, lives outside the camp for 7 days, and then comes into the camp. So it seems to me that it becomes part of the process for a Gentile to join Israel. They have to go through this Numbers 19 purification. And I think that lends even more weight to the importance of understanding what we talked about when we went through Numbers 19, how Jesus fulfills Numbers 19 and the whole tetelestai. What did he mean when he said it is finished? As the hyssop branch entered into the crucifixion scene, becomes very, very important to understand how we as Gentiles need to go through that purification process to enter into spiritual Israel. Does all that make sense?
One quick question.
Go ahead.
Moses' wife is
Yeah, totally.
and so is his father-in-law Jethro, who was
Uh-huh.
a priest.
Yep.
How do they play into this? They're obviously not mentioned in there. I'm just wondering if there's any place else where it's even dealt with.
Yeah, I actually thought about that. I don't have a good answer for that question specifically. What about Jethro and what about Moses' first wife? Because his second wife wasn't from him.
He'd moved to Hollywood already, Beverly Hills.
Yeah, his first wife Zipporah was a Midianite. We don't know whether he took a second wife while she was still alive or if she died somewhere along the way. Some people like to think that she died somewhere along the way so that they don't have to admit that Moses was a polygamist. I don't think that matters so much, because David was, so like why wouldn't Moses be? Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really have a good answer.
So it talks about when Moses was angry, and it says, kill every male among the little ones.
Yes.
Which means that the females were little ones. That he had, not the women, but the ones that were kept alive, they were little ones.
Sure.
So what is he saying when he says keep them for yourself? Are we talking about what I think we're talking about?
I think we are. Yeah, I don't want to sugarcoat it. Yeah, I think we're talking about that.
So, okay.
Would they take them as daughters?
I think that they would take them maybe for their sons. That's something that happens later on, but
Okay.
I think they also...
But not right then, at that moment, were they taking them for themselves?
You know, I can't make a definitive statement about that. It seems like there were young women And it would not, all the young girls, in verse 18, young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. So that would be some form of slavery, whether it was for them or for their sons.
What do you mean by slavery?
You make me say it, I mean sex
I
slavery.
mean, we are talking about that?
I think that's what we're talking about, yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to make you say that. I just want to make sure, like, we're on the same page, that's all. Like, no, I'm sorry.
I mean, it's definitely not pretty.
Okay,
It's warfare.
but why, okay.
You're reading, okay, so remember Moses' history. What happened in Egypt around the time that Moses was born? Pharaoh was killing all the males, all the male children, right? That's what they do here. Pharaoh was trying to accomplish something. God thwarted it in order to bring redemption for his people. Later on is telling Israel to do the same thing to another nation.
Yeah, I get that. I think the thing that I don't get is, well, how is that righteous taking little or young girls for sex slaves? That's the part I'm talking. Like, okay, so maybe that was the culture, but can we believe that that's God's heart at that time? I think that's what gives me pause.
I think it should give us pause. And I think it should give us, it should make us pause long enough to consider what we mean by, can we really say God is righteous if this is what he's doing? And what happens by the why was Midian being punished?
Because
The Baal is and the Peor, right?
Yeah,
But we can go a step beyond that. They broke God's law.
right.
This is the same reason that the 7 nations in Canaan are going to be punished. The Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, all these guys. We're going to get to Deuteronomy chapter 7, and it's going to describe how they broke the law, and that's the reason that they're being punished. So that God holds Gentile nations to the same standard as Israel, and the things that they're going to go through are the cursings for disobedience of Leviticus chapter 26. What Midian is facing is the cursings for disobedience of Leviticus chapter 26. So if God was really righteous, okay, really truly righteous, what he should have done was killed all these young women.
I say that one more time, sorry.
If God was really truly righteous and was going to do what Leviticus 26 says he's going to do, and the cursing for disobedience, they all should have been killed.
Right.
But what happens is there's a preservation of Midian through these young women, and I think that goes, it doesn't feel good to us because we're looking at it as sex slavery. But what it actually is God preserving something that did not deserve to be preserved. So it's really even a step beyond righteousness into justice, redemption that I didn't foresee God doing for Midian.
So, I know you have to move on, but a great way to summarize this maybe is that they were preserved, let's say, even though they should have been killed, and they're preserved by humans who have human needs, and so they're being taken care of, and they're not going to starve or die in the desert, but also they're going to please these men. Is that a way?
We don't know that.
I don't think
We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know that.
So, remember, this culture.
Well, he just said sex slaves.
Well, not in every case, maybe. I think maybe I overspoke. Let me say, maybe not in every case.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
like, women married young,
Right.
far younger than we would find acceptable
12 to 13
in
years old.
our culture,
Okay.
right? So, a young girl would have been preserved up to the point where she could marry
Mhm.
either a son or the man himself.
Okay.
right?
Okay, cool. I'm good with that.
Yeah, so it's like you have this, and that's actually a very important thing to do to be preservative, because being a single woman past the age of marriage
Yeah.
was a death sentence.
Yep.
Sure.
Right, because you had nobody to care for.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. And that was God's heart of righteousness. I totally see that.
Yeah.
I just was trying to match up the other part.
Yeah, and I think maybe I think I did overspeak when I maybe wrongly implied that all of them would be sex slaves. I think you have people, young girls would have been taken into houses to serve within the house until they got to a marriageable age, things like that.
Okay.
So I think I misrepresented that. I'm
That's
sorry.
fine. And thank
Oh,
you.
Along the same lines, you get a little bit further, and 32 of these young girls are given to the Lord. What did the priest do with them? They didn't sacrifice them.
You'd have to give me a reference for.
Oh, we'll get to it.
Oh, the
We'll
Lord's
get to it.
share.
The Lord's share.
Oh, like at the end of this chapter.
Right.
Yeah.
So what did the priest do with them?
Yeah.
Well, I would assume that the priests, they have homes, just like everyone
Just
else in
use them.
Israel. It would
Okay.
be kind of the same situation.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if they went to the temple and those.
I wouldn't
they get-
think so, because they're coming from another nation. And while other nations do join Israel, a la Rahab, there are limitations to what they can do in the tabernacle and temple up until Jesus. That's why you see in Herod's temple, there was a Gentile court, because they were welcome to come worship God in the temple, but not in the same way as Jews. So I think I'm picturing probably the same sort of thing, going into the houses, becoming servants in the houses, things like that.
Jewish priests were not celibate like Catholic priests,
Right.
supposedly.
Supposedly.
Okay.
Thanks, John. You're the best. So the rest of this chapter basically says that they did that. They did all the things they were told. They brought the sacrifices, all those things. Everything was good. I'm going to move quick past that. Is there any questions on it before I because I'm just jumping over it otherwise. Okay, I'm going to move on. So Reuben and Gad. So the people of Reuben and Gad had a very great number of livestock, and they saw the land of Jazer and the land of Gilead, and behold, the place was for livestock. Where's the last time you saw that?
Genesis 13.
It's Lot. And it's actually, if we take a look at this map, and you probably have a very similar map somewhere in your Bible, if you look at where Reuben settles, on the right side of the Dead Sea, you see kind of the dark brown there, it says Reuben. That's where Reuben settles, and that is exactly where Lot settles. Sodom and Gomorrah would be on the, you can't see my mouse, I always forget that. They would be on the northeast sort of corner, the top of the Dead Sea there. So this is exactly where Lot settles, and it's the same pattern where you have Reuben and Gad. So the place was for livestock, and the people of Gad and the people of Reuben came and said to Moses and to Eleazar, the priest and the chiefs of the congregation, those guys, the land that Yahweh struck down before the congregation of Israel is a land for livestock, and your servants have livestock. And they said, if we have found favor in your sight, let this land be given to your servants for possession, and do not take us across the Jordan. Okay, which direction was the gate on Eden?
To the east.
Which direction is the door to the tabernacle? Which direction would you go away from the presence of God?
West.
As you're walking out of the tabernacle to the east. And which direction does Lot go? To the east. So what are we dealing with here with Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh settling on the east side of the Jordan River and not being willing to go in and conquer?
Walking away from God.
They're going away from God. This is going to be a huge problem later on towards, I think it's the end of Joshua, but it might be like the beginning of Judges. I don't really remember. Once the place of worship is set up on the west side of the Jordan River, these eastern tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, are like, what if the people on that side forget about us and they don't let us come over and worship God at the temple? And so they set up this altar between the people, and it's supposed to be this sign, and then of course, people are people, and exactly the thing that they say happens, and it's this whole rigmarole. Moses says, Shall your brothers go to war while you sit here? Will you discourage the heart of the people of Israel from going over into the land that Yahweh has given them? Your fathers did this. When I sent them up from Kadesh Barnea to see the land, for they went up to the valley of Eshcol and saw the land, they discouraged the people of Israel from going into the land that Yahweh had given them. So what is Moses comparing the actions of Reuben and Gad to? He's comparing it to the 10 spies who went up into the land and came back, they gave a bad report and discouraged the people. And Moses says in verse 13, because of all these things, Yahweh's anger was kindled against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And I imagine that Moses is probably a little bit bitter about this, because he's now not even going into the promised land with Caleb and Joshua, the two spies who gave a good report. And so he's looking at Reuben and Gad going, this generation did evil in the sight of Yahweh, and you're going to do the same thing. He's calling them out for wanting to dwell here on the east side of the Jordan and not wanting to enter in. And so they come to a compromise. They say, we're going to build houses, we're going to build sheepfolds, we're going to leave our families here, but we'll send our fighting men in to conquer the land. And once Yahweh has driven out his enemies before him and the land is subdued before Yahweh, then after that we'll be free to return and we'll possess this land before Yahweh. So that's the arrangement that they arrive at. And Moses says, yeah, that's fine. What Yahweh has said to your servants we will do. We will pass over armed before Yahweh in the land of Canaan, and the possession of our inheritance shall remain with us beyond the Jordan. And Moses gave to them the land, the kingdom of Sihon, king of the Amorites, the kingdom of Og, king of Bashan, the land and the cities with their territories, and they set up all these cities, and that's how that ends. So, when I read this story, Numbers chapter 32, it doesn't to me seem like at first a big issue. We're going to dwell on this side. We have livestock, and this place is good for livestock. We're going to go in and conquer the rest of the land, but we're going to leave our families here so that they're safe, and then once the rest of the land is conquered, we're just going to come back and we're going to live over here. That doesn't sound like it's a big problem. Until you read it in light of Lot, and then until you get further on in the story and see exactly what the division of the Jordan River does to the tribes that are living on each side of it, it really becomes a huge dividing issue within Israel, even to the point that by the time the northern tribes and the southern tribes split around 910 or so BC, those eastern tribes on the east side of the Jordan, they're pretty much not a part of Israel anymore. Like, they are there, and they're part of the story, but like, they don't have a say in anything that's going on in Israel. They're not politically part of the government of Israel anymore. They just sort of exist. And they really kind of drop out of the story.
I'm just wondering why Moses compromised here. When he brings this all out, look, it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just, it seems to me, he should have said, no, everyone's going to cross over.
Yeah, but also he's 120.
Yeah, I know.
So he's probably pretty tired.
I was just thinking, you just look through the Bible at all the compromises they make.
Yeah.
Like they're going to go on and they're going to define the territory here in a little bit of where they're going to go,
Mm-hmm.
and that's going to be perfect. But they never really take it because they just make more compromises and treaties, even through Solomon. They finally have it, but they don't have it because they didn't push the people out.
So I pulled up a couple of maps to look at tonight. If we were to look at Genesis 15, which is the first promise where God promises to Abraham the land that they're going to get, it goes from the river of Egypt, which is presumably the Nile, all the way to the river Euphrates. So you have the red line on the bottom left, and you have the red line on the top right. Everything in between there was supposed to be Israel's, if Genesis 15 is the way that we're looking at the Promised Land. In a few chapters, in chapter 34, it's going to talk about the boundaries of the land, and I'm kind of jumping ahead. But if we look at, on the legend on the bottom right of this map, it says Numbers 34, 1 through 12. And so the red line is showing us, to our best approximation, because not every place is exactly known, but where the boundary in Numbers 34 is talking about. It is much smaller than in Genesis 15. But it is also much bigger than what Israel will actually possess by the end of Joshua. Because if you look at the top, where you see where it says land of Gilead, at the top left of the blue part there. If you go northwest from there, you get to the Sea of Galilee. On this map, it's called the Sea of Kinnereth. The ESV spells it Chinneroth. So it's talking about the Sea of Galilee. But going north from there, they're supposed to get all this land. They're not actually going to end up possessing any of that by the end of Joshua either. So it's like the land that they were promised in Genesis 15, it just keeps getting bites taken out of it every time there's unfaithfulness. So, yeah.
But it's the Lord's land. That's
Well,
what
yeah.
they're forgetting.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, totally.
So it's like, it's not yours really. He told you to take it for him.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I wonder if this is Moses having gone through it the first time with the first generation and not entering, that he's just like, I'm not going to let someone stop this again. We're going in.
Interesting.
And I wonder if that's just like he learned from Yahweh that we press forward into the things of the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, just a thought there.
It's a good thought.
So that's really interesting. That were you talking about even now, like those tribes no longer are considered part of Israel?
Which tribes?
The ones that I forgot who they were. Was it
Oh, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh?
Yeah.
So today, the only tribes who can actually trace their lineage is Judah and Benjamin, and maybe some Levites.
I was going to ask about Levites in particular. So how interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Because they did not.
Because they went into captivity in Babylon.
Right.
The other 10 tribes were dispersed by Assyria and mixed with the other nations. There's no longer, today, there's no traceable lineage to, no one could come and say, I'm part of the tribe of Zebulun. Yeah. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Chapter 33. This is going to be recounting the story. It says, I want to read verses 1 through 4. These are the stages of the people of Israel when they went out of the land of Egypt by their companies under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Okay, so remember that Genesis was written by Moses. We don't know exactly when it was written by Moses, but it is the...
Sinai. Sinai.
Maybe. I think Sinai. It is the... what do you call it when a book is telling the story that happened before the story? Prequel. Genesis is the prequel. But if Genesis is the prequel, then shouldn't we kind of think about the Bible as beginning with Exodus? So I just want to put that to you. I like to think about it that way. It sort of helps me put Genesis in its proper place of what it was supposed to do and be for the nation of Israel. So if I think about the Bible as starting at Genesis 1, and the revelation of Yahweh, if that's the case, doesn't really take place in creation. It takes place in a burning bush. That's the first time Yahweh shows up in the biblical story if we start the biblical story at Exodus. And I think that's what Moses is doing right here. He's starting the biblical story at Exodus. And he's retelling the story, and he says, these are the people who left Egypt. So in his mind, the biblical story starts with the chaos of slavery in Egypt, and it goes through the separations of the water and the land rising up in the Red Sea, and it goes through the separation of light from dark in the land of Goshen with the plagues, and it goes through the redemption. The story starts with God making a nation out of chaos. And I think, now I'm very happy to read Genesis 1 literally as well as literarily, but I think we have to read it literarily, because if we look at the Bible as starting in Exodus, then we look at the prequel of Genesis, the creation account lines up with Israel being made a nation. So it's so much more. If Moses stopped with a whole bunch of people who were freaking out because they were following a cloud through the wilderness and representing a God they didn't know, and thought that the thing that they needed was a history lesson about the scientific creation of the world, and he's not only an idiot, he's the worst leader who's ever lived. And I don't believe that about Moses. So I don't believe that that's what Genesis 1 is for. I do believe that while I primarily read it literarily, I can still read it literally. Is that okay? Okay. So he's going back, he's saying, these are the people who were redeemed out of Egypt. Moses wrote down their starting places stage by stage, the command of Yahweh, and these are their stages according to their starting places. They set out from Ramses in the first month, so that's where essentially where the story of Israel starts, is Ramses. In the first month, on the 15th day of the month, which is the day after Passover, which means that the story of Israel begins with the death of the Lamb. Pretty cool. The people of Israel went out triumphantly in the sight of all the Egyptians, while the Egyptians were burying their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them, which means that the story of Israel begins with the defeat of chaos, which I think is pretty cool. And on their gods also, Yahweh executed judgment. Yahweh executed judgment on their Elohim, which means that the story of Israel begins with a spiritual victory of Yahweh over other gods, which I think is pretty cool. The next, whole giant paragraph is just a list of all the places where they camped. There was a couple in there of note. You remember Mara means bitter. It was where the bitter water was made sweet. There were the places where there wasn't water and Moses struck the rock, and then the place where he wasn't supposed to strike the rock. So there's a few places in there that should bring back memories of the stories that we've read since Exodus chapter 12 when they went out of Egypt. I don't want to read all those places right now. I'm going to jump down to 50. Yahweh spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. So he just went through all the places where they were, all the places where they camped. Now they're camping in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. And this is what Yahweh says to Moses. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you pass over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you and destroy all their figured stones and destroy all their metal images and demolish all their high places, and you shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given you the land to possess it. You shall inherit the land by lot, according to your clans. To a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance, and to a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Wherever the lot falls for anyone, that shall be his. According to the tribes of your fathers, you shall inherit. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, okay, so did you just notice some conditionality? Okay, so this is like Leviticus 26 all over again, right? So if you're obedient, land. If you're not, if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them whom you let remain shall be as barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall trouble you in the land where you dwell, and I will do to you as I thought to do to them. And that line might be the biggest indicator in my mind that what God is doing in the conquest of Canaan is applying the cursing for disobedience of Leviticus 26 to the other nations. Because if Israel doesn't take them out, then Leviticus 26 happens to them instead. I think so too. Chapter 34, the whole first part here is the boundaries of the land. I just showed you the two maps, and that was really all I wanted to talk about. So unless anyone has any major pressing questions, I'm just going to push right through this and jump to, and the tribal chiefs. The list of tribal chiefs, these guys, their purpose was to help divide the land for the inheritance. It says there in verse 17, and again at the end, these are the men whom the Lord commanded to divide the inheritance for the people of Israel in the land of Canaan. So these guys are set aside from each tribe for that special task. Pretty cool. Great. Okay. So the cities for the Levites. There are going to be 48 of them. Right? There's 42 cities, and there's a total of 48. 42 of them are just going to be normal cities where the Levites can live, and those cities are going to sort of just be spread around all the other tribes. How come Levi doesn't get its own land?
It gets no inheritance because the Lord is there.
So you're talking about Exodus 32, right? Yahweh's going to be your inheritance, but why don't they get land in the first place?
They have a place in every tribe.
They do. Cities, and they get to farm the land around the cities. But what I'm asking is
there land the tabernacle?
Yes, but that's not what I'm getting at. Do you remember Genesis 49? When Jacob, right before he dies, he speaks all these prophecies over his sons. And the ESV, the title says Blessings of Jacob or something like that. And it's really kind of a silly title because most of them are not blessings at all. And he says about Simeon and Levi, well, he says about Reuben, because you slept in your father's couch or whatever it said, and he talks about how Reuben is basically cursed. It says blessed, but I'm going to say cursed. And then he gets to Simeon and Levi, and he talks about what they did to the people at Shechem. Do you remember this story? The defiling of Dinah, which took place in Genesis 38, Simeon and Levi made a contract with the men of Shechem that they would get circumcised And then they used the time when everyone was in pain from being circumcised to go wipe out all the men of the city. So they used the sign of the Abrahamic covenant to essentially commit genocide because they were mad about what happened to their sister. And because of that, actually I'm just going to jump there. Genesis 49, it says, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Let me see here. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So when we see the 12 tribes get their inheritance in Joshua, Simeon is going to get a small little piece of land completely surrounded by Judah. And as the biblical story goes on, they just sort of disseminate into the rest of the tribes. They sort of disappear. They're not really talked about much. And then Levi also doesn't get an inheritance, and it has to do, again, with this, their anger and their wrath that they committed at Shechem. But the thing that separates Levi from Simeon, because they're prophesied together right here, is that Levi stands up in Exodus 32. When Moses says, who is on the Lord's side, Levi stands up. And so we have this twofold prophecy that seems to contradict itself, except that God is awesome. One, you don't get any land. And two, I am your inheritance. And I think that those two things are the way that they go together, because Levi, the person, was so scummy, and Levi, the tribe, stood up to be on the Lord's side. And so both of those prophecies that seem to contradict each other are really perfectly fulfilled together. And you have the cities of the Levites. Among the cities of the Levites, 6 of them, so there's 48 total, 6 of them are going to be cities of refuge. And let's jump down to cities of refuge. Verse 11, you shall select the cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person without intent may flee there. The city shall be for you a refuge from the avenger. The word for avenger in Hebrew is goel. Another way to interpret goel is redeemer. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Don't let me finish this without talking about that again. If I forget, bring it up. Then the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation for judgment. So if someone kills a person, didn't intend to kill them. In other words, it was an accident. They accidentally killed someone. Maybe their axe head flew off the handle, right? That's a story later on in the Old Testament. What they can do is go to a city of refuge and get a trial. They get to stand before the congregation for judgment. You have 6 cities, 3 on one side of the Jordan and 3 on the other side of the Jordan, and these 6 cities shall be refuge for the people of Israel and for the stranger and for the sojourner, so this is Jews and Gentiles, that anyone who kills any person without intent may flee there. But if he struck him down with an iron object and he died, he's a murderer. The murderer will be put to death. If he struck him down with a stone tool, same thing. With a wooden tool, same thing. Murderers are put to death. Verse 19. The avenger of blood himself shall put the murderer to death. When he meets him, he shall put him to death. What's an avenger of blood then? An avenger of blood is the closest blood relative, usually a brother, to the person who was killed. So, have you guys ever seen the movie The End of the Spear? It's about missionaries in Ecuador, Nate St. Jim Elliott. If you've never seen it, that's your homework. It's amazing. You need to take a note, write it down, watch that movie. It's fantastic. One of the things going on in the Ecuadorian tribes that these missionaries were trying to reach out to was blood vengeance, meaning that for generations, these tribes had been killing each other in revenge for the people that the tribe had just killed. And it went back so far that no one knew who killed the first one, so it would never ever stop. That's what's happening right here. So if I accidentally murder someone, that person's brother has the right to murder me. But if we don't know where it started, then when that person's brother kills me, my brother can go kill that guy. Okay, so this is what the cities of refuge are doing. Is if you kill someone accidentally, you go to a city of refuge, and it is a place where you will be safe.
Try.
blood?
Tried.
Doesn't the victim of blood then pollute the land?
It does, and I'm going to get to that because it's amazing. That's later on in the chapter. He dies and he does not do harm. Okay, so the congregation, so you said tried. So here in verse 24, the congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood. In accordance with these rules, the congregation shall rescue the manslayer from the hand of the avenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge to which he had fled, and he shall live in it until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the holy oil. So, if he's found to have accidentally murdered someone, he gets to live protected in the city of refuge. The avenger of blood is not allowed to touch him. If he is not a manslayer, if he's a murderer, then he's not allowed to be protected by the city of refuge. Until the high priest until the statute rule. I need to find that. Where is that? Verse 33. Okay. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land. And no atonement can be made for the land for blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. So, if someone dies or is killed, their blood has polluted the land, and the only blood that can make atonement for it, it's not the goats of the Day of Atonement, it's not any cow or anything like that, it's only the blood of the person who killed and spilled that blood. Then, when that blood is spilled, the first blood is atoned for. So, death for death, right? Except, the manslayer is allowed to freely leave the city of refuge and be safe from the avenger of blood once the high priest, who is in that position at that time, dies. Which means that the guy whose blood needs to be shed can be substituted out for the high priest.
Oh, wow.
Right? It's Jesus.
Yeah. Wow.
There you go. Okay, I love that.
John?
Yes.
That whole blood, no atonement for the land,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of reminded me of Judas.
Mm.
But didn't something happen to the land after Judas killed himself?
I think you're thinking of the purchase of the potter's field,
Yes.
which is what they did with the money that he
No.
threw back to the
I thought-
Pharisees.
Or maybe I'm thinking of some extra story and nothing happened to the land after.
Well,
I don't
something in
remember.
the gospel?
It was never, no one ever used it. No one ever worked that land again. It became desolate.
Yeah,
Mm.
so, but not blood. So, never mind.
I don't know.
No, so it's.
If you can believe it, I didn't study the Gospels in preparation for teaching numbers today.
But it just came to mind that it was the same atonement, or that he was the one that.
Yeah, I don't remember.
That's fine.
Okay.
Move on.
Look it up and send it out in the email
I
this
am
week.
gonna do that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna look it up.
So is this rule sort of only now being put in place? Because the first thing I think of when I read this is, God didn't do that to Cain. He let Cain kill his brother, and then he said, Cain goes, I'm afraid now it's going to be done to me. Okay, I'll put a mark on you so nobody will kill you. Well, why wasn't blood for blood there?
I don't know.
Okay. New rule. It's a new rule.
I think it was a different kind of death.
Well, no, it's murder. I mean, you know.
Well, and that's a weird situation too, because it was a brother who was murdered, and there was no other brother until after Abel died. Seth wasn't born until after Abel died, so there was
Nobody
no
really
blood.
to murder.
I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah, well, that's maybe just a different set of circumstances.
The ground.
I suppose he would have, yeah, because there was no brother, so he would have had to then kill Cain. And I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah, I have one more question.
Go ahead.
So you talked, I saw you make that, I saw the connection that you were making with Jesus, which was awesome. But the question that I had was, I looked back to try to find out where they talked about this anointed high priest.
Mm.
And is that part of the established by the Lord, like one of the Levites high priests? Is that, and it's just known? Because I was like, who anointed him with oil? Like, where did this high priest come from?
Well, the high priest, the first one was Aaron.
Oh, okay.
And then his
Okay.
his first two sons died. His second two sons,
Yeah.
Eleazar and Ithamar.
Got it.
And Eleazar was the high priest at this time. We read a few chapters ago, I think. And then presumably before Eleazar dies, he would make his son a high priest.
But he wasn't part of the judging or whatever. Like I was thinking it was separate from that. I don't know why, but
Okay.
I got it.
You're good then?
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
I'm not sure what you were asking, so I don't think I answered it.
You did.
But okay, good.
Oh,
Great.
you-
Cool.
Yeah.
I worked my way into that one.
Yeah,
So Jesus is a high priest.
Yes.
Totally. Yeah,
That's where you
Hebrews.
left
Jesus
off.
is a high priest.
Were there two other things to say?
Oh, what was I going to say?
Oh,
Something
never
about the
mind.
Goel or something.
Oh, the Goel. Okay, so the Avenger of Blood. Goel means Redeemer. The Avenger,
Verse 12.
yeah, thank you. Verse 12. I can't see the numbers right now. There we go. Refuge, Avenger. Okay, so Goel. If I just pull up Goel on the Bible Word Study and I look at where it shows up, this is Ruth chapter 2. Naomi says to her daughter-in-law,
He's my Redeemer.
"May he be blessed by Yahweh, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, the man, talking about, oh no, what's his name?
Boaz?
Boaz, thank you. I was like, I just said it before class. Boaz is a close relative of ours, one of our, and the Hebrew word is Goel. So the idea of the kinsman redeemer goes beyond murdering the person who murdered your brother, but it actually is going into the idea of the Levirate marriage, if you've ever heard of this. It's when the one brother dies and his brother has to have a kid with the wife of his dead brother in order to continue the line of his brother. Glad we don't do that today.
Only the Bidens do that.
I'm not touching that.
Tamar.
Just gonna leave that right there.
Tamar, John.
Yeah, Judah.
Yeah, Judah and Tamar. Thank you. Yeah, totally. Levirate marriage. Judah and Tamar is exactly the example we should go to there. Okay, so marriage of female heirs. So do you remember back in Numbers chapter 27, the daughters of Zelophehad, they went to Moses and they were like, how are we supposed to get land? We're all ladies. And this whole culture revolves around men. And then there was the whole Moses was like, yeah, you're going to get land anyway. So the heads of the fathers' houses, of the clan of the people of Gilead, the son of Manasseh, the clans of the people of Joseph, they come here to Moses, and they say, in verse 2, Yahweh commanded my Lord, talking about Moses, to give the land for inheritance by lot to the people of Israel, and my Lord, you, were commanded by Yahweh to give the inheritance of Zelophehad, our brother, to his daughters. But if those daughters go and marry someone from another tribe, then they're going to take their inheritance with them to that other tribe. And then we of the tribe, of this tribe, are going to lose the inheritance that should have belonged to our brother just by virtue of the fact that he had no son. Is that really fair?
Keep it all in the family.
But if you look at, ultimately, if you break down their question to its most simple form, what they're asking is our inheritance safe? Is our inheritance protected? Or can we lose our inheritance? And Moses' answer is, let them marry people from your tribe. So if any woman is in this situation and she has the inheritance that would have been her father's, they have no brothers, and she's possessing the land, let her marry within the tribe so that at the time of the year of Jubilee, the land doesn't go to another tribe, it stays within the tribe. So Moses' answer to what seems like this sort of convoluted situation that we don't care about today, this has nothing to do with what I'm going to get up and do tomorrow, his answer is your inheritance is safe. And when you look at the promised land, because we have a promised land, right? We have a future land that God has promised to us. It's the new heaven and the new earth. And so we should be, if we're anything like these men, going, well, is my inheritance safe? Is my inheritance secure? And what this story is telling me, even though these people have nothing to do with my life or anything to do with how I'm going to live it, what it tells me is that what I have coming to me is secure.
Like your salvation.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Verse 9, so no inheritance shall be transferred from one tribe to another, for each of the tribes of the people of Israel shall hold on to its own inheritance. So it is secure. And this is the really weird story that ends the book of Numbers. It just seems like it kind of stops in this strange, abrupt place and screeches to a halt. And Moses just says, these are the commandments and the rules that Yahweh commanded through Moses to the people of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. And that's the book of Numbers. It ends in this super weird spot, unless you go, oh, what this is telling me is that the inheritance that God was going to give to Israel cannot be taken away. And so it creates this really neat, amazing chiastic structure that we've talked about 100 times with Exodus. Where does Exodus start? Israel is in slavery to Egypt. They have nothing to call their own. Yeah, Egypt put them in the land of Goshen, but that still belongs to Egypt. They're allowed to live there because they have livestock, and Egypt doesn't like, cattle. But Israel has nothing to call their own. And the contrast at the end of the book of Numbers is that what Israel has to call their own, what Yahweh has given them, can't be taken away from them. And so it creates this amazing contrast. So, how does this promised land, inheritance, how does it look like Eden?
Well, they're coming from the east,
Mm-hmm.
west across the Jordan into it.
Yep. So Eden, remember, I'm going to look it up for you. Eden, Genesis 2, I'll do it this way. Search for Eden. And Genesis 2:8, Eden means
East.
to live a life of luxury or to let things go well. So this promised land is a place where Israel gets to go in, of course, after they've taken out the nations. And the idea, if they will act in obedience and conquer it, is that this is a place where they will live a life of luxury. This is a place where God is going to bring rest to this nation that has, from the time that they were basically created into a nation, when God brought them out of Egypt, they had never rested. They've been on the move, they've been at Sinai, they've been given laws, they've been at war. There has never been rest in the nation of Israel. And what the promised land is this place that to them looks like Eden. But they know the story because Moses wrote the story. They know how Eden ended. So doesn't it make sense for these men to be concerned about how am I going to lose Eden? I need to know what's going to happen when I go in there, and when I go back to the west, I go cross the Jordan River, I do the opposite of what our fathers did when they crossed to the east over the Red Sea, and I cross to the west over the Jordan River, taking possession of the land that God has given me to be a place of rest. Can it just be taken away? Just like Eden was from Adam and Eve. And the answer to that question here in Numbers is no. But this is the Mosaic covenant, which is conditional or unconditional? Conditional. Can the land be taken away? Yes. And it will be, because they're going to split into two. The northern kingdom is going to be dispersed in 722 by Assyria, and the southern kingdom is going to go into captivity in Babylon in 586, and the whole thing is going to be taken away, and it's going to be awful.
But it won't be taken away as long as you follow what I've told you to do,
Right.
and you remain in it.
Yes.
Then it will remain yours. But if you break my covenant, then I'll take you completely out.
And the breaking of the covenant would be equatable then to the eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So in the day that they break the covenant, they will surely die.
However, the foreshadow to the losing your salvation cannot be broken. So while those things are correct and conditional, he's also, don't you think, giving a foreshadowing of what cannot be taken away?
Yes, but I think that foreshadowing comes in the form of the Abrahamic covenant, the Levitical covenant, in the future the Davidic covenant. These are your unconditional covenants. And the new covenant, which is the covenant we're under, is unconditional.
Right.
In the same way that the Abrahamic covenant was unconditional, but in order to enter into the unconditionality of the covenant, you had to remove the covering circumcision, right? If you remove the covering, I don't need to be any more graphic than that, but we're dealing with atonement, right? To enter into the new covenant, which is unconditional, there's no work that I have to do, but there's a covering that has to be removed. And the New Testament calls it the circumcision of the heart. And yeah. And so in the same way that circumcision acts as a sign of the Abrahamic covenant, this is why I think that baptism is the sign of the new covenant. Because the thing for us, the removal of the covering in the Abrahamic covenant was external. But the circumcision of the heart is not. Signs are external. Every sign of the covenant is an external thing that can be inspected. The thing that can be inspected for us is when you take that action of baptism, not as a work required for salvation, but as a sign that an internal change has taken place, right? And so that's why I look at baptism as the sign of the new covenant. Yeah. So yes, it is looking forward to something that can't be taken away. But the conditionality remains for Israel that they need to keep the covenant or they're going to get kicked out. And we know the story.
Yeah.
So, how are we doing? Go ahead.
I was just thinking that the cool thing about it is that we know the end. Is,
Yes.
You know, that Israel is never gone. It's God's, people.
Yeah, and they're going to come back into Revelation. We see God still has a purpose for them there. Yeah, exactly. Cool? All right. We kept time low. That was a very Uganda way to say that. Let us, okay, so I am approved to use this video for private use. I'm not being paid to do this, so it's not professional, it's personal use. I'm asking you, please don't record anything on here. There's copyright stuff at play. This is not going to go up on YouTube, so we're going to check out this video. I think you're really going to be blessed by it, especially as we talk about the way that form conveys meaning. Obviously, Tim, we've heard from him a lot, pretty much every week in this class. He's one of my favorite Bible teachers, and he is really going to show in this lecture form in a way that, like, we have just begun to grasp at as we talk about chiasm and things like that. So, enjoy. That was a lot. Man. So, yeah, the place where we were created for was Eden, and the place where we belong is Eden. And Numbers ends with the question of, is the inheritance safe? And Moses answers it in the affirmative, and of course that won't hold true for Israel necessarily because of the conditionality of the covenant, but it does in the new covenant and what we're looking forward to in the new creation. And so that brings us to the end of Numbers, and we have one book left, and then we're done studying Torah. Or at least together. I hope you're not done. Yeah. Anything else tonight? We're a couple, or like a minute early, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Dave, will you pray for us?
Sure.
Thank you.
Father, wow, what a wonderful book the Bible is. How intertwined with our inner being the Bible is. How it points us to Christ, and how it points us that we need a renewing of our heart. And I just thank you for all the study that this group has done, that I got to participate just a little bit in. Just thank you for your word, that it's eternal, that it's sharp, that it leads us in our path to righteousness. We just praise you for this class in Christ's name.
Amen.